So Bunyan's life is changed. Now, some of the things I've missed out in this, and I'm really sensitive to the fact that we're almost over time, and I'm about half a page into 10 pages. So we're here all night, Keith. How much tape do we have to run this video? This is the challenge for Bunyan, is as he's going through these epic moments of pendulum swing, he marries a woman, and he has 4 children by this woman. The firstborn, his name's Mary, and she's born blind. Now, part of the tragedy of this first marriage is history's never recorded the name of his first wife. I think it's a desperate problem because she is so meaningfully impactful in his life. So she comes to the wedding, and they are dirt poor. In fact, Bunyan says that between the two of them, marrying and trying to set up a house, they didn't even have one dish or one spoon. That's how desperately poor they were. But she did bring to the marriage 2 books that her father gave her as a wedding gift. One of those books was the Plain Man's Path to God, an old Puritan description of how to journey toward salvation in Christ. And Bunyan would read it time and again and would try and find that path and find that way. But of course, the striving in his own energy was part of the problem. He couldn't rest and recline in Christ. Now Bunyan is converted. We'll go back to where we left off a moment ago. He's now converted. He's got 4 children. His eldest is blind. And he's laboring as a tinkerer just to make ends meet. It's desperately hard to do. There's almost no money in this particular trade, and he has no skills. He's ostensibly uneducated. He can't do anything else. But now that he's converted, he can't keep his mouth shut. Whereas before he was the town's blasphemer, profaner, swearer. Now he's a preacher of the gospel. And what he's noticing is that unlike before, where he'd open his mouth and he'd just spoil everyone with his curse words, now he'd open his mouth to proclaim Christ, and people would gather. It was as much a shock to him as anybody that people actually responded to his preaching. And he would start preaching in the open air, and people would gather, which represented, again, this is going to be a little bit hard for us to get our head around, it represented a threat, because they were now considered church gatherings. And you couldn't hold church gatherings. It was illegal to just hold random church gatherings on the street. It was illegal because there was no way to control that. There's no way to tax that. There's no way to declare what can be said and what can't be said. The Anglican Church liturgy in that day and age was word for word already pre-prepared by the royal theologians and the king and the powers that be. So you could only say the things that's why all the prayers were written out. That's why all the liturgies and the sermons, the homilies were all written word for word. Because it was all decreed to you what you could say as a minister of God. But Bunyan would just go out in the open air and just begin to unload his heart and proclaim the gospel, and people would gather and they'd start having church every day of the week all across town. And the church up on the hill, the wealthy church, the compliant church, they were desperately offended by this. The ministers were offended, partly because, well, they didn't have the guts to do it. And secondly, because there's no real way to justify Bunyan's gift because he's uneducated. He didn't come out of Oxford and Cambridge and the great Bible schools of that era. He's got not even a primary school education. How is this tinker out on the street corner preaching Jesus so desperately, compellingly, clearly, in a way that's drawing hundreds of people to hear him? So the antagonism begins to build. What happens is Bunyan is found guilty of holding a dissenting meeting, or in other words, what's called a non-conformist meeting. In 1656, he first preaches in public. In 1653, he's baptized. In 56, he first preaches in public.